Hi, welcome everyone. Hello. So lovely to see you all here. My name is Kevin Kerr. I'm the chair of the Department of Writing, and it's my very, very great honor and privilege to get to welcome our visiting Orion artist, Michael MacLennan. And I'll read a little bit about Michael before he walks on stage. So Michael's been nominated 7 times for the Writers Guild of Canada Screenwriting Award and was named the WGC's 2018 Showrunner of the Year. A producer of nearly 300 TV episodes, his credits include Queer as Folk, Godiva's, Flashpoint, Bitten, and The Fosters. In addition to multiple pilot scripts for CBS and ABC. He's created Bomb Girls, which twice received Canadian Screen Awards Best Series nominations, and was honored as Outstanding Dramatic Series by the US Gracie Awards. He recently served as showrunner of the Bletchley Circle San Francisco and created the hit show Tiny Pretty Things, Netflix's #1 series worldwide for 14 days. Michael began his writing career as a playwright with plays performed across North America and Europe. His first play, Beat the Sunset, garnered Vancouver's Jesse Richardson Award for Outstanding New Play and the Theatrum National Playwriting Award. Grace won the Theatre BC National Playwriting Competition, and The Shooting Stage and Last Romantics both won the Voden Prize and were Governor General's Award nominees. For 9 years, Michael lived here in Victoria, first to attend UVic, where he received first-class honors degree in English, then to work in some of the city's most renowned arts organizations, including Kaleidoscope Theatre, Victoria Arts Collaborative. He was the general manager of the Victoria Fringe and director of Open Space Art Society. He served as vice president of AIDS Vancouver Island. His first plays received world premieres at the Fringe Festival and Belfry Theatre. He was one of 6 co-creators of the groundbreaking summer-long theatre festival As Deep as Your Throat. Before moving on to Vancouver and subsequently Toronto and Los Angeles, he served as the interim performing arts officer of the BC Arts Council. Today, Michael's going to be speaking to us. His lecture is called How to Kick... I can't even read my own left-handed writing here. How to Kick an Elephant, a border town survival guide. So will you join me in please welcoming Michael MacLennan.
I'm all blushing now. Do you guys want to snag a seat down here? Unless you're looking to make a quick getaway if you're not entirely sure about this. Neither am I, so thank you. Where I grew up, I was always, every day, looking over the border. This was across the Strait of Georgia, just that away, in Tsawwassen, where at the age of 4, my father moved us in order to be at a safe distance from the big bad city he policed, a rural community that was a patchwork then of oat fields, forests, and a growing grid of houses on half-paved roads. A town the name of which, as the voice on the ferries continually reminded us at the time, was, quote, an Indian word meaning facing the sea. But growing up in Tsawwassen, the direction I mostly faced was not those watery vistas east and west. Rather, I and others were busy looking elsewhere, namely the long, grassy ditch at our town's southern limit, a ditch that on the other side of which sat a small nub of a land that happened to be another country. I'm talking about Tsawwassen's American doppelganger, Point Roberts. The bottom half of our peninsula, this freak of geography, of politics, was made officially American in 1846 when the Oregon Treaty extended the 49th parallel to the Pacific. Vancouver is shaped like a giant thumbs down. If it is, then Point Roberts is that last sort of digital phalange there, the thumbnail below the knuckle, inhabited by a mere 2,000 people, living isolated from the rest of their country. It's a pointless divide, a geographic glitch born out of uninformed negotiators, a rare place along the border where, it might be said, Canadians have the advantage. I grew up off 2nd Avenue. Living there, I never once met a professional artist. South of 2nd was, of course, 1st, and south of 1st was that ditch that marked the border. My friends and I would jump it to buy cherry Coke and visit our horse named Deja Vu, which was boarded cheaply on a forested acreage. From there came my first job washing dishes at Hawthorne's restaurant. At 16, I had my own American Social Security number. There was a TV station in nearby Bellingham, Washington. Every day after school, it played syndicated series: Gilligan's Island, Bewitched, I Dream of Jeannie, My Three Sons, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, Carol Burnett. These old shows taught me about story, about dramatic structure, the crafting of conflict and comedy. I also learned what the world had decided was worth paying attention to. At 18, I moved here, the first in my family to go to university. My folks weren't entirely sure what it was all for, and truth be told, neither was I. And yet, living and studying here in this small school at this bottom tip of an island, surrounded by another country, on the edge of an edge of an edge, I found my voice, my courage, my community. I finally did meet artists, painters, performers, dancers, writers. It was here that I was inspired to quit my job to embark on a writing career. Paradoxically, it was from this edge that I found the wider world and my value in it. That said, my plays were rarely large stage events, spaces mostly occupied at the time by British or American playwrights. I was told my themes weren't mainstream enough, that my writing lacked qualities sufficient for wide appeal. So I jumped that ditch again, this time to find new avenues for my ambition as a screenwriter and TV producer, writing television that would be seen by millions. They say Los Angeles is the 4th largest Canadian city in the world, that it holds more Canadians than Calgary or Halifax or even our own capital. Naturally, many there work in film and TV industry, making cultural product for a country that is not their own. Why did I and so many others do that? Was it the carrot of money, resources, and reach? Or was it the stick of frustration up here at such puny vision that had me mustering the courage to leap to where I had always looked? Nowadays, it's like this. On the other side of the ditch stands a building. We know it well. We all grew up studying its blueprints, its floor plans, its unique architecture and enviable size. Except now, that building is on fire. It's late at night. Most folks are asleep. And when the alarms begin to sound, no one wants to get out of bed. Even so, a few respect the alarm and put on their robes and shoes and start some orderly, unrehearsed procession down and out. And even though there aren't many, because the stairwells and doorways are so small, it's getting crowded. It's getting crowded, and soon folks feel a growing urgency to evacuate, a rising panic. Soon options become clogged, and besides, there's nowhere to escape. Then come some of us Canadians doing something utterly bizarre. We are actually trying to get inside that big burning building. We are walking up there through those very same stairways, squeezing past the exiting smoke-choked throngs, telling them, excuse me, pardon me, I see there's a fire, but if you don't mind, I'm just trying to get in there past you. In fact, I'm trying for the attic. Now, you may say you don't want inside that building. You may not dream of a green card or, God forbid, citizenship. But what we do aim for is a sort of American endorsement, American-level success. After all, our population itself is less than that of Poland. Without our neighbors' embrace, our reach is limited. In some way or another, we want in, or we're told we want in by the gatekeepers and tastemakers busy measuring success in terms that aren't even ours. Let me start this again. Let me try and tell this a different way. In 1969, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau went to Washington to meet with President Nixon, a leader at odds with Trudeau's own values and aims. In a speech, Trudeau delivered an indelible idea about how we see them. He said, quote, "Living next to you is in some ways like sleeping with an elephant. No matter how friendly and even-tempered the beast, if I can call it that, one is affected by every twitch and grunt." The remark drew applause and the kind of pitied laughter you might hear from a crowd watching tricks performed by a poor, mistreated dog. It's not the sea that most of us are facing, but rather that elephant. Over half our population is south of North Dakota. 75% of us live 150 kilometers from the border. We all know this. We've heard it before. But what do these facts mean today and what do our aims as artists and our metrics of success mean when all evidence shows that those twitches and grunts are no longer merely the seismic farts of an economy, nor the rumblings of America's latest military campaign, nor are they the latest technology to change how we know our world? What do we do when those noises are now, by the reckonings of most every expert and sentient citizen, nothing less than an empire's self-eviscerating death throes, its waters rising, its politics ossifying, its rights asphyxiated, its democracy hobbled, all in service of an open pursuit of what at best will be what Fareed Zakaria calls a liberal democracy, and at worst, a fascist theocracy. The elephant's final, uncorrectable tilt may come as soon as this year's presidential election, or it may take longer, after the next cadre of populists finish corroding minds, empowering hatred, and silencing dissent. I've lived in it, the seeping influence of this new dark populism within a brittle system whose norms of decency are washing away. Of course, this new and noxious terrain is now infesting our own political discourse, our social mores, our capacity to listen and speak to one another. Whatever they say down there, we listen to. Now, if you dismiss this assessment as overblown catastrophizing, I hope you'll stick with me here. Not because I hope to convince you I'm right. This isn't really a talk about political science or the global rise of tyranny, but because I hope I'll be able to swing this somewhat bold notion to something more approachable and in a way more meaningful. I want to look at what we talk about when we talk about America and how in simply paying attention, we might recognize a renewed need to rise up, to assert our collective sovereignty, to not just look at the elephant, but yes, to kick it. Because facing a thing is not the same thing as seeing it. A wrinkled, spastic mass can be too much to grasp. We may prefer not to recognize what we are absorbing, the erosion of trust and respect between leaders, the shredding of political norms, the terrible tilting of the world's largest economy. And yet, hey, we know what happens. Winds change, empires end. Look at Hungary, at Russia, Zimbabwe. Look at Turkey, at the Philippines, at India. But don't, whatever you do, look down. And while our reasons aren't good, they are understandable. After all, when a panicked elephant charges, it's impossible to predict where it will go. And when an expiring elephant goes and keels over, it most certainly takes down everything in its shadow. In the chaos of the fall of such a mass, will our flailing neighbor reach out for whatever's nearest? Will it grab for our water, our land, our trees, our city, our oil, our soil? We all know the rules of how to deal with the drowning. Keep a careful distance, lest in terror it drag you both under. I've had to accept that the elephant I've been sleeping with, the beast that burnishes my reputation, that gives me confidence and wealth and reach, is up to no good. I've based my career thus far on a gambit that once seemed wise and now leaves me troubled. What am I doing living in a place so at odds with my own values and aims, where I have so little political agency? I'll tell you what, I am trying to fuck shit up. I am writing within the confines of my industry roadmaps for transformation, for disruption, for questioning authority, and standing up to oppression. This was not when I started my career something I thought I'd be doing. But when I was in LA writing Queer as Folk, the American body politic was dealt a blow that had felt shattering and now seems almost quaint. George W. Bush had won re-election. And after talking about it daily in our writer's room, we came to want to find a way to embed these critiques within the narratives of our show. And since then, I've understood my value, writing from those margins. You can look at the ongoing centrality of my queer characters, or look at shows that I've made that place women in unique corners of history, like Bomb Girls, which is World War II, or Bletchley Circle, which is the 1950s. In 2003, my series Godivas had a South Asian lead, a choice I'd made against the wishes of every producer and exec I came up against. Similarly, Bletchley's lead was an African-American woman, and of course, as was the lead of Tiny Pretty Things. I'm interested in telling the stories of people who are underestimated, unrecognized, derided, invisible. I suppose it's a case of write what you know. But more important than representation is what I'd call volition. Narratives that give you comfort and inspiration and show how it's done. Now you might say, how can television, the popularist of popular art forms, with structured formats as prescriptive as a sonnet, how is it able to do such a thing? What good is art against a nuclear arsenal? To that, I'd offer another axiom: use what you've got. Margaret Atwood has argued that the central symbol for Canadian literature is survival. Today, that survival is less about enduring harsh landscapes and deadly weather, and more about our very existence. We need to inoculate ourselves to build some serious bulwarks, to train that gray, wrinkled beast into respecting us, into making such an invasion, literal or metaphorical, all but unthinkable. Canada will not achieve this through political means. We have no real power, hard or soft. It won't happen militarily either, our guns against theirs. I mean, come on. It won't be economic heft or international sanctions. Our allies will be merely a cavalry of fleas descending to do battle on the elephant's hide. And so we are left to become weaker. Are we left to become weaker, more dependent, more frightened? Who is left to defend the world's longest undefended border? To the artists out there, along with those who lend them support, I say you are. The ditches sit there, ugly and useless. It might be said they're a waste of good land. You know, countries, man, I know the whole idea is kind of messed up. But sometimes when it floods, as has just happened, incidentally, in Los Angeles this past week, sometimes those ditches have a job to do. Just 8 kilometers away from us, closer than we are now to the Swartz Bay Ferry Terminal, across the Haro Strait, sits San Juan Island. In 1859, an American settler killed a pig owned by his neighbor, a British farmer. Since the island's nationality had yet to be settled, both countries claimed sovereignty. Canadians were operating a sheep ranch and a lime kiln, supplying all the mortar that was used to hold together Victoria's every brick in the city's every building, at least until that pig went down. The shooter offered $10 to its owner, who deemed the amount, about $300 in today's dollars, insufficient. Things escalated. It was eating my potatoes, the shooter had argued, and the pig's bereft owner replied, well, it's up to you to keep your potatoes out of my pig. British authorities moved to arrest the shooter, leading American settlers to call for military protection. Americans and Canadians living together on the same island. In an armed standoff came encampments on the island's 2 sides. 13 years this went on. 13 years of confrontation and bluster before the German emperor stepped in to arbitrate. It was the closest the US and Britain had come to combat since the War of 1812 and the last armed conflict between us and them. We call it a bloodless war, not a single shot fired, unless, of course, you count the bullet that did in the pig. And in case you're wondering, we lost. American statesman George Bancroft presented a brilliant, virtuosic argument, and the Kaiser was persuaded. America told the better story. Had they not, those islands out there, Orcas, San Juan, and Lopez, we'd be looking out across those waters today and we'd see ourselves. Déjà vu, indeed. How do we stop seeing a ditch and start seeing a vista? What do we do when what's a block away is also a world away? How do we stop the cultural and civic erosion within our own quarters? How can we recognize a burning building when we see one and sound the alarm? Let me start again. 50 years after the Pig War, the Canadian government, having noted alarming buildups of American troops along the border, went and hired Lieutenant Colonel James Buster Sutherland Brown to devise a plan for how to counter this. The plan he concocted was called Defense Scheme Number 1. It had little to do with defense, since it was in fact a plan to invade the United States of America. The idea was that if need be, Canada would advance 5 armed thrusts to seize key American cities. Then, as you might recognize this very technical term from a few minutes ago, they would fuck shit up during the inevitable retreat once the Americans woke up and worked up a counterattack. This bonkers plan by, yes, Buster Brown, if I may call him that, offers 3 key ideas that I want to try on for size, as they may be useful to us artists and supporting entities should we be called upon to work up our own battle plan. But before we do this, a little dramatic suspension here, let's get clear on what we artists are good for. To do that, I'll draw on a lecture that was presented here in Victoria 35 years ago as part of a conference called Creating in Context. This lecture by Newfoundland artist Pam Hall became a clarion call to many artists within our community. Pam Hall spoke of how artists are the explorers and expressors of values, beliefs, superstitions, and aspirations of the larger cultural and political unit, whether that be a city, society, a gender group, nation, or tribe. She spoke of how, quote, the cultural voice is important in the contemporary context because it is a prime instrument, a major building block, a roadmap necessary to the attainment of cultural consciousness. She spoke of societies that are not culturally conscious and lack self-determination, what Brazilian philosopher Paulo Freire calls a culture of silence. Such cultures are dominated by another culture, dependent on its dominator. The direct culture speaks, while the dependent culture listens. Its own voice a mere echo mimicking the voice of its dominator. What cultural voice this silent culture may be able to muster is barely heard above the noise, and worse, is often not even authentic. Hall writes of us Canadians, quote, as a culture of silence, we not only remain ambiguous about our own culture, but often lack confidence in its value. In so doing, we have sent many of our artists abroad to seek the freedom or rewards that the practice will not bring them within their own culture, and have stranded many of those who remain in the traps we have accepted or adopted from the dominator. And yet, it's our imagination, which Pam Hall defines as, quote, our mind's capacity to project itself beyond its own immediate perceptions and sensations, our alternative generator, our scenario builder, our ability to invent and model, to extrapolate from the known and experienced to the unknown and undiscovered. It is a fundamental ingredient in the creative process, reflected not only in art making, but in problem solving in which we humans engage. Hall continues, if one is unable to imagine new realities, one is unable to imagine the transformation of old or current realities. For the individual then, imagination is a liberating tool necessary not only for expression, but for autonomy. For me, Hall depicts both a compelling problem and the necessity of solving it. But how? Famously, Canada gained its independence from the UK without a fight. Do we risk now losing it as well if we don't learn how to rumble? To do that, Let's go back to old Buster Brown. Let's unpack those three ideas and see if they might help us know how to buck impossible odds and do battle against the elephant. The first idea I want to flag in Buster's plan is that his expected battles would be fought on American, not Canadian territory. This kind of strategic depth has us breaking things on their turf, presumably until, in his case, Britain and the Empire showed up to save us, as if that would ever happen. Extrapolated for our purposes is the idea of fighting in arenas that our foes value, and in doing so, using their own language and references as recognizable tools to amplify our voices and be understood by those who need to hear it. We co-opt their tools, their language, their media, their forms, and by inhabiting and reappropriating these containers as our own, we might use it all against them. Secondly, Buster's plan relies on the notion that for the silent culture, surprise is more important than preparation. Canada can't hope to win a drawn-out battle against America's superior strength, but we can get traction and make some noise if nobody knows we're coming. And why would they? I may have been watching Gilligan's Island, but it and America as a whole was certainly never watching back. As Atwood reminds us, quote, Americans don't have to think about Canadian-American relations. Why think about something that you believe affects you so little? We, on the other hand, have to think about them whether we like it or not, end quote. Instead, Americans are today fixated on their own southern ditch and the region beyond, a twisted, noxious obsession that could very well spell its own undoing. There's a fearsome implication to our invisibility, namely that their ignorance of us gives cover to those dark populist leaders who may be looking for Americans to passively co-sign Canada's envelopment. But we work with what we've got, right? And if they aren't watching us, that gives us means to persuade, to recontextualize, to shift the terms of the conversation. This we can do. After all, we're already down there, making much of their culture for them. We've softened their image, honed their mythologies, masked their deeds with humor. What if we now used our knowledge to probe and expose? What if we began telling a different, better story before they could get a word in edgewise? The third and most interesting notion is that after our managed retreat, any subsequent fighting that would continue on Canadian ground would be decentralized. It would be from the margins, these scrappy units embedded within larger structures across the country, and thus impossible to ferret out and destroy. Because if you're the insurgent, all you have to do is not lose. You simply have to outlast the enemy. Buster, our friend there, saw the value in the stamina and invisibility of a loose resistance, guerrilla warfare in cahoots, if not necessarily in concert. For these groups spread out across the country needn't trouble themselves with knowing exactly what each other is doing. All they need do is share the same cause. An inspiring comparison recently chronicled by the writer and activist Sarah Schulman is the grassroots political group AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, known as ACT UP. Through the 1980s and 90s, the organization became one of the most effective and transformative social movements in American history, not despite its decentralization, but because of it. It engaged in direct action, medical research, treatment and advocacy, legislation, and public policy, notably benefiting enormously from the contributions of women and people of color. Within ACT UP, people never had to agree on a single strategy or priority. Instead, the group, quote, met people where they're at. In Schulman's words, activism doesn't mean taking people down. Activism is about opening doors. Members were encouraged to find their own means of achieving a shared bottom line. In their case, working to end the AIDS pandemic. Your talent is not mine, nor do we share the same boulders we wish to advance. But if each of us puts a shoulder to something, we can move mountains. Schulman argues that, quote, you can't attack people who don't line up 100% with what you think. To demand that people in every community have to be in agreement is a fool's game. Applied to this notion of art and its transformative potential, perhaps it's time to stop policing what each of us is thinking and doing, and instead turn that energy into supporting and enriching each other's capacities and contributions. Filmmaker John Waters, that pope of trash once demonized by the Reagans and moral majorities of the world, now remarks that he's long ago lost any threat of retribution from the right. Now the right ignore him and his ilk. Why waste their energy policing and censoring him? After all, Waters says, the left is now happily doing that dirty work instead. What if we stopped tearing each other down over the smallest of perceived heresies and instead fought the forces that seek to silence us? What if we stopped policing our own pointless divides and instead used these energies to lend each other courage, to foster a greater sense of a shared front? What if we worried less about each other's means of expression and more about finding a shared bottom line, honing a vast arrowhead of justice? To conclude, am I talking about a literal invasion of a literal country here? I'm actually not sure. I do know that in the same way that Victoria lost its supply of mortar after we ceded San Juan Island, we all now risk losing crucial components of what hold us together. I know that whether it's metaphorical or not, we have an important job to do. I know that only a voice, an authentic voice, can shatter that culture of silence. Oscar Wilde, himself from Ireland, another kind of border town that looked across a wider ditch at its own overlords to the south, wrote, "The present is what a man ought not to be. The future is what artists are." I know that there is tremendous creative and expressive activity in America that exists in alignment with us. But I also know that if the elephant is in distress and wildly faltering, then we must save ourselves. I know that your existence here on at least some kind of a margin is not only useful, it's necessary. I know that those among us who may be more acutely aware of their own marginalization, those who navigate the borders of our bodies, our races, our sexualities, even age and belief, they are the ones with the psychic musculature to lead. I believe that among those most essential are our First Nations who have garnered the knowledge, convictions, and leadership, who, having prevailed after various campaigns intending their own eradication, also have the numbers to be key in leading the charge. Your job is no less and no more than to work out who you are and what you're for. To remember that the role of the artist is one of assisting humanity in coming to its senses. As participant observer, you are putting together the big picture as investigator, expressor, and trader of meaning. You engage not in wishful thinking, but in what Pam Hall calls wishful making. All of us need to both keep a watchful eye on that ditch, but we also need to engage with new horizons and expand the terrain of our imagination in order to thrive in a changing world. Your job, in short, is to read the story, to know it well, and then to tell a better one. Of course, America is far from the only dominating culture our own silent cultures are staring down. It may soon, however, be the most pressing one, and thus most capable of uniting us in its opposition. It may be that in developing our creative capacities, our habits of support and courage building, in honing our ability to see and communicate alternatives, that we can continue from this one necessary existential fight and find the strengths and allegiances and momentum to keep on going until we end them all. What if your very lack of centrality allows space for possibility and germination? What if you are what, beyond these waters, the wider world needs? Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I didn't say so before, but I think we might have a little bit of time for questions for Michael. Is that
Yeah,
is that,
sure.
is
Yeah.
that, is that cool?
Yeah.
Yes. Does anybody have any questions? I have one.
Great.
I'm just curious about your experience. You know, when you moved into LA, into that space.
Yeah.
How present was your Canadianness as you entered those writing rooms? And I guess, you know, did Buster Brown have allies across the border that were like looking for a fight like that? I mean, I don't know historically, but did you feel like you were moving into spaces where you were finding those kind of, you know, rebel outposts?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, firstly, I think when I moved there, I kind of thought we were basically the same, you know. So I didn't really understand my Canadianness until I wasn't in Canada, and I feel like there's this sort of sense that, oh, we're basically the same. You know, I know what they're talking about. I know their shows and their culture and their the language, of course. But you start to realize we're just very different. You know, different everything from different senses of humor and different kind of values, fundamental values. But there's a kind of I guess one of the good things for me about my now half of a life spent there is that it sort of made me more understand myself more clearly as a Canadian and have a kind of weird pride in it that I don't think I had before. And there's a kind of curiosity about it, and I always remark I feel like it's the last surviving accent that you can mock and not get like totally canceled, you know, like. But as soon as somebody says you're Canadian, it's like, oh, what's that all about? And you know, I hope I wasn't saying that the house was on fire there, the burning building or whatever. And it's sort of, so there's a kind of curiosity, but it's a very kind of patronizing one. And I think it's meant that I sort of have been kind of hidden in plain sight, and I've learned to, you know, change my accent and things like that to not sort of come across as immediately Canadian, at least in some situations. So I think there's a kind of, people were uncomfortable in a way that other people were kind of coming in to make cultural product on their turf. And, you know, they would cite the comedians or whatever that they admired, but there was a sort of chip on the shoulder, I would say. So I think that, I mean, the things when I was moving there, but there wasn't the same kind of existential crises that I think America's facing right now. So those sort of things weren't of interest. Now most people are just sort of interested in figuring out how they can get this way, sort of out of that burning building and across the way. And, you know, you sort of talk, they sort of talk to you like, you know, the bouncer, and you know, you can be like, you in the back. Yeah. You come on in, click. Justin Trudeau just sort of opens the velvet carpet and or velvet rope and lets you in or something. It's like, it doesn't really work that way. So there's a kind of awe of the country, I would say, but there's a profound ignorance about it, even among, you know, people that I consider good friends. They just don't have the access to information or history or knowledge. So I don't know if I really answered your question. Can you? Okay. I don't know what Buster Brown would say about. I think he'd probably say, get in there and attack while the getting's good. But you know, notably the report was shelved. People thought it was preposterous. He was commissioned. He was asked to do it, and of course it was considered unlikely to be necessary and also unlikely to succeed. But I found it sort of, in a sort of bonkers way, sort of interesting way of kind of examining how do you think about going up against a larger force, whether that's a military force or a cultural force, and at least developing our sense of how we might go about that should the necessities come. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Questions? Yes.
Hi. I know you talked about representation and queer characters and how important that is for you. And I was curious if you could touch upon your experience with that in the industry, if like you overcame like rejection and how you worked around it, or if you think it has changed for the better over the few years. I was just wondering what your experience was.
Sure. Well, I think when I started, it was, obviously it's the degrees and quality of representation and the range of representation has really improved, certainly in my career. There was a certain sense of stress whenever you would sort of pitch something, even a sort of modest kind of subplot or something, let alone an ongoing character. And that to some degree still remains. Of course I was on Queer as Folk and that was the #1 show on its network, Showtime. And they never expected it to do well. So we sort of were kind of hidden in plain sight in a way at the initial part of that. And I think that what people didn't understand was that they didn't expect people who weren't a member of that community to want to watch it. And of course you don't get to #1 if you're just some gays are watching it. Like it had to be doing something else. So that really kind of, I don't want to say radicalized me, but it certainly gave me confidence and a kind of respect, or I don't know what the word is, but where you're sort. But then people also expect you to only do that, and I think the way I've sort of approached writing from the margins is it's code. You're writing code. I mean, TV is a popular art form. You have to apply if you're going to succeed. You have to reach a wide audience, and so it can't just be about trying to get your point across or try and think overly political. You embed that sort of thing in the conversation, and you embed diversity and even queerness in the conversation, but it's sometimes coded. And so a lot of the stories that I would say are kind of my most sort of queer don't even have nominally a queer character in them, but I feel like they could only have been written from my point of view. And that's the sort of stuff that I'm more interested in now. We've sort of got this whole game of, ticking boxes of you need certain people in a cast. They've got an ensemble cast of a show. And it's like, well, you need these sort of things. And those things just sort of become a bit of it's like collecting, scout badges or something. You got to kind of get them all on your arm before you get the green light on a show. And that's less, I think that's less meaningful and less potent than really kind of understanding the value of those perspectives and respect and kind of portraying them, I guess I'd say. Yeah.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for the inspiring talk.
Thanks.
I'm feeling a bit of secondhand happiness for you, the circularity of you starting off here and now presenting.
Oh, thank you. I feel it too. It's really nice to be back. It's been such a great week. Yeah. There's a lot more buildings here. None of them are burning, but there's a lot more buildings here now. Yes.
So I was curious about your question, what are artists good for?
Yeah.
And I'm curious to hear more your opinion on this as not only a professional artist working in professional artistry, but also I get this spiritual artistry about you. So the soundbite was that they were in a culture of silence. So I was thinking how artists are good cultural listeners, and this can be synonymous with the idea of cultural awareness, consciousness. And then you said that we should read stories and then write better ones. So I'm hesitant or curious about this starting point of artistry, that we're constantly responding to something, and that our production is a response to something else. How do we get out of the trap of always just being good listeners, or that the thing that we're creating is a response to something that hasn't pre-existed?
Wow, great question. Well, I think there's a way of expanding what story means in that. The story, of course, we're postmodern world. Everything we create is a response to something else. It's just kind of a 'twas always thus sort of thing. But if you're looking to sort of escape that, then I think it's about, obviously you have to know your art form. You have to know what else is good out there and study it and see why and see what you respond to and often find your voice in kind of opposition or in alignment with the history of your work. And so I do really believe that you need to know your where you stand in that kind of vector of whatever you do's development. But knowing the story is simply knowing it's kind of goes back to your first point of, I don't think you used the word absorbing, but it was something like absorbing. And listeners, that just listen to the world. Like, you can go to the source. But I do believe that when I think about why I pick up my pen or whatever your art forms may be, it is a kind of response to a thought that is in itself a response to something in the world, whether it's the beauty of a forest or the horrors of an injustice. So those things aren't about responding necessarily to what was written yesterday, but what was lived in what your life was yesterday. And to be clear, I'm not saying we all have to make serious, down in the dumps, political theater or whatever. Like, not that there's anything wrong with that. You can do that through comedy. You can do it through frivolity. You can do it through satire and play. And it is about embedding those ideas, but recognizing that there is a sort of role of an artist that's beyond, in my view, that the things that endure are about something more meaningful and they reflect the time. So maybe for you, it's about, I can't remember my own thing, but reading the story that's being told outside of these walls and not necessarily inside of, theaters and books and that sort of thing. Does that kind of go? Okay.
Yeah. Hi. I have a question, kind of, about Canadian-American relations.
Yeah.
I have one Canadian parent and one American parent. So
Encampments on either side of the house. Just like
and I also, when I was quite a bit younger, did some traveling and talked to a much older American man who was absolutely shocked when I mentioned that we had our own broadcasting system. Which seems insane. So, I just kind of want to know more about talking about this sort of sneak attack and the silence and sort of living in plain sight in the States as a Canadian. It's sort of should we keep our secrets, or how do we share our Canadianness, our Canadian knowledge, our Canadian culture with Americans in a way that's palatable? How do we embed that sort of?
Well, I think you use the tool. I mean, if it's about, which is a lot of what I'm talking about, is more about talking across borders than within ourselves. We use their means. It's the strongest cultural producer in the world. We're not going to reinvent the broadcasting. We have our own, segment, however beleaguered it is these days. But we're not going to sort of create a new technology necessarily, but we're going to use their tools. And we're going to use, the thing is, we are kind of bilingual. And you, especially as somebody who lives in a house that kind of maybe you sort of understand what that means. So we can speak their language in a way. And I'm not just saying English either, and we're already there. Like I say, we're already making a great deal of the cultural product hidden in plain sight, to use your words. But I'm losing the thread of the question. Sorry. No, there was something I wanted to say that, it's about talking to one another versus sharing our plans or whatever. I think it's really just this interesting idea of, I sort of came to this sort of idea. I'm getting personally frustrated by our interest in choosing kind of the low hanging fruit of policing ourselves, when we are basically, it's like we're, if genetically, artistic, we're so close, we're very much in alignment. I'm not saying there's room for debate and for challenging each other, but that we're doing it in a way that's sometimes performative, and sometimes we're doing it because it's the easiest thing we can do, and we're not reckoning with larger, bigger swings that might be harder to accomplish, harder to succeed at, but actually do make something that's more helpful for us. If we just keep tearing ourselves down, that's kind of what I'm not saying they're our enemy, but that is what the enemy wants, right? Is that, you do the dirty work for each other. And we're just in a sort of, I'm not going to get into the whole, cancel culture and all of that, but I think we're at a point where there's been an overcorrection around a lot of this, and I'm trying to sort of reframe it as not only it's bad and not useful, but it's more urgent that we kind of find different ways to kind of reach out. But that being said, we don't have to have a plan to not share. That it is about each of us just feeling empowered and courageous and inspired enough to do what we want to do in that kind of decentralized paradigm. And not feel like, well, by carving something out on my own, I'm exposing myself. I'm not even worried about the tsunami that from across the ditch. If you can get a tsunami in a ditch, I don't know, but it's more like just the person next to me is going to like silence me and criticize me, and so for me that's a shame. Yeah.
I mean, having created content on both sides or engaged in those systems, like, do you see a big difference in terms of how they operate or in terms of the stories that you're able to engage in? Would you approach them differently, like working in one place over the other?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest way I would sort of put it, like the sort of most kind of macro way, is I think that Canada really operates in a scarcity mentality. So there's this idea of like we can only do so many things and they can only be this so much money and only so many hours, and this is all we get for our allotment. And so there's a real attachment to how little we have, and there's a much more expansive approach. And let me just say on that side that I'm not saying everyone is like this. I mean, I've had so many happy experiences working in Canada, and so many people I respect and enjoy. But that it sort of trickles into a sense of smallness, and that they're always sort of looking for the reason to say no, and there's a more expansive sense of assuming that what you're about to pitch me is brilliant, and if I don't get on it, somebody else will, and wanting to meet this person because they're clearly, you like this idea that all boats are rising, everything is that the default is that it's good and it's going to make me a bucket load of money, and so I want to hear it, and I'm assuming that it's going to net me success. So I feel like sometimes I kind of don't mind the Canadian mentality because it's a little more like a handmade sort of creature if you can kind of get it there, but it just means that often great ideas don't go anywhere because there's not really, certainly within the Canadian realm, the Canadian system isn't really that interested in making Canadian television. It's interested in buying American stuff and putting it on the airways. It's cheaper, it's more profitable, and it's easier. So there, it's sort of like the cost of doing business, whereas America is the business. And again, there's tons of exceptions on either way, but that's kind of where I would find it. But both are frustrating. I mean, both, there's a whole flavor of the month kind of thing that goes on in the States that can be frustrating, and there's a kind of usual suspect-y sort of thing in Canada that I find can be dispiriting sometimes. So yeah. Hi.
I was thinking about what you were saying, like that in order to be considered a success here, you kind of have to have had some success in the States, or at least I feel that as well. Like we're so saturated in their culture that there's this feeling of like, if I'm succeeding here, like what does that really mean? Or I guess it's like playing scared mentality is like either you're going to go for it, which means to leave, or you're going to just kind of be doing it, but like we're not going to really believe that it can be that much, So yeah, I guess I don't know what I'm really asking here, but I guess I'm just I'm just curious.
Well, I think that's the value of a margin, though, a geographical margin. A place like Victoria, I'm not saying you're all going to. I'm saying to everybody, don't leave Victoria, but I don't think I'd be a writer today if I hadn't lived 9 years in Victoria. That it was a crucible that brought me confidence and community in a way that I don't know that I would have had in a larger community. And certainly if I had just, gone to New York with a dollar in my heart or a dollar in my pocket and a dream in my heart, I would have just been completely overwhelmed, and I don't think I would have ever amounted to anything. And I think that I want to push. I do think that we value, and that's what I was saying. Like, we want that, and even if you don't want it, the people around you want it. And if you're writing a novel, you want an American publisher. If you don't dream of not having an American publisher, like, that those things are that's your leverage, right? That's your population. That's your chance for the quote big time, whatever that means. But that the way we hone our voices is outside of those mainstream larger centers. And so I was thinking about that when I started working on the lecture, because I was thinking about how I came to be who I am and how grateful I am for that. So I guess I'm trying to flip the script, which is, I think, something I said in Rachel's class a few days ago, around the inferiority sort of complex that I think we are up against major sort of systemic headwinds that do want to sort of make us feel silent and can't be heard above the noise, but that is really a powerful place to exist because no one's paying attention, because no one is looking across the waters, and that can be a really exciting place to be. Yeah. Especially for people who are maybe at this early stages in their finding their voice, understanding that there's good in that.
I'm just conscious that this hour, not surprisingly, has just flown by. So I'm going to close with that, but there may be opportunities still to engage with Michael. He's here right now and he's here tomorrow a little bit more and stuff. So if you have more questions you want to talk to him, I don't want to throw that on you, but I'm sure there'll be a chance to maybe engage. But maybe just join me again in thanking Michael for his fabulous presentation.
Thank you. Thanks.